Well, Brian, I'm super excited you're joining me today. This will be really fun just to kind of talk about faith and your background and this new book you have coming out. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Good to be here, Jonathan.
Well, this is awesome. I kind of came in contact with your story through Instagram, and I think it's a really fascinating story. I think this will be a lot of fun to unpack. It's definitely not a path that's traveled a lot. Most people kind of find their way as a pastor or whatever and stay that way for most of their entire lives in kind of that same role. You chose a little bit of a different path, but let's first talk about kind of how this all started. You grew up in a conservative household, went to Bob Jones University. Talk to me a little bit about that experience, because I don't think most people that are listening to this podcast know anything about Bob Jones. So if you could unpack that a little, that would be awesome.
If you know what Bob Jones is, get in therapy, I guess, is what I tell you. My dad is an independent fundamental Baptist pastor. In other words, fundamentalist was not like a label that he avoided. I think there's some Christians that we might say, like, they're like a fundamentalist. And they would be like, no, I'm not a fundamentalist. I'm like a regular Christian. My dad would call himself a fundamentalist. Like he would freely embrace that label. Bob Jones University is where he went to school, and that's a fundamentalist Christian university that, again, calls themselves a fundamentalist university. And what that basically means, the difference between fundamentalism and mainstream evangelicalism is a little bit subtle, because their theology is quite similar. Both fundamentalists and evangelicals both believe that Jesus is the only way to heaven, that if you're not a Christian, then you're going to hell. But fundamentalists are much less culturally engaged. So they're kind of defined by being very separatistic in everything. So everything is worldly. Movies are worldly. Music is worldly. I couldn't go to the movie theater. We didn't listen to secular music. At Bob Jones, you have to get all of your music checked. Like your hall monitor is like what they called RAs would, you'd have to submit any music. If you got found with uncheckable music, you could get demerits. You couldn't go to the movie theater, even to a rated G movie. And what they would say is that, well, if an unbeliever saw you exiting the movie theater, they wouldn't know which movie you saw, and they might think you went to a rated R movie, and that would ruin your testimony. So it was all this thought about like being perceived by the world as holy, as set apart, and the world was something that you kept at a distance. And so that was very integral to the way that I was brought up. And I kind of felt strange for most of my life. I mean, I was homeschooled before I went to Bob Jones, and Bob Jones is called, like a nickname for it is the bubble, right? So I pretty much felt like I lived the early part of my life in a bubble.
What would you say to, let's say in the off chance there's a couple kids that are going to Bob Jones that are listening to this? What would you say to them? You have their ear for 1 minute. What is the elevator speech you would give to them if you're like, crap, I have a room full of Bob Jones students and I got 1 minute with them? What do you say?
An interesting thing is that I found the student body there to be really interesting because most of the kids that are there are not drinking the Kool-Aid. I would say a lot of them, like I was there, that's where my parents really wanted me to go. And I feel like a lot of my friends there and a lot of the people there were there because they were told by their parents, that's the only school we'll pay for. If you go to any other school, you're on your own. Like basically you're cut off. If you want your connection to us, we want you to go to Bob Jones. So that kind of hierarchical parental control led a lot of kids there. And so it was I would say only probably about 20% of the student body were like all in on the Bob Jones way of thinking. We even had a name for them. We called them Boges. A Boge was somebody you could not trust to be yourself around them. In other words, you couldn't just be freely talking about how, yeah, of course I watch movies and I listen to music like a normal person. You had to kind of pretend because you could get turned in. There was a narc culture where people would turn you in. So I guess it would depend on who they were. It would depend on whether or not they were, they wanted to be there, they were all in, or they were being forced to be there and that sort of thing.
So you finish school and you quote unquote, become a pastor. Talk to me a little bit about what that was like coming from this very strict, you can't walk on the grass, Bob Jones University.
That's actually true. You can't walk on the grass. That is true.
I have some friends that went there and told me some of the rules.
The upside
that
of that is the grass was very beautiful. We just couldn't walk on it or sit on it or anything. We could look at it. It was lovely.
So talk to me a little bit about what that was like transitioning to like from Bob Jones to a
Yeah.
kind of
So it's
everyday
interesting.
American church.
I didn't grow up wanting to be a pastor, partly because that version of fundamentalism that I just described was not very attractive to me. It was what I knew, but it wasn't exciting to me. And it was actually at Bob Jones that I went through my what I call my first deconstruction, which was deconstructing fundamentalism and becoming a more mainstream evangelical. And basically that just happened through exposure. The people that I connected with the most at Bob Jones were not the fundamentalists. They were people who may have been made to go there. They were there for various reasons, but they didn't actually buy into fundamentalism, but they were still Christians. And for me, that was important because I didn't want to ditch my entire faith. I just wanted to be a person. I wanted my humanity back. And Bob Jones really made it difficult to just be yourself in many ways. And so when I found a version of Christianity, like I said, evangelicalism has a lot of the same dogmatic exclusionary doctrine. Most evangelicals are still anti-gay. They would say being homosexual is sin. They would say, again, like anybody who's not a Christian is going to hell. So there's some things in there that are still very exclusionary, but I could, as an evangelical pastor, I could wear jeans. I could listen to music. I could get tattoos even. I could drink an
You could
occasional
drink
beer as long as
whiskey.
I didn't get drunk. Go ahead.
You could drink whiskey, smoke a
That's
cigar
right. Yeah.
maybe.
Evangelical pastors are notorious for their whiskey drinking, actually. And so I think when I encountered that, I was like, oh, good. This is a way that I could just like be more human, be more myself without ditching the theology, without becoming a heretic. And I didn't want to be a heretic because at that time I was raised from a very early age. I mean, I'm talking 5 or 6 years old. When I first learned about God, I also learned about hell. And for me, those concepts were quite inseparable. So the idea of moving away or deconstructing my faith was frightening. The stakes were just too high. And so being an evangelical was quite appealing. And for the first few years when I became a pastor, I really enjoyed it. And it felt very spacious. It actually felt like a lot of freedom compared to what I grew up in. And it was a few years in that I realized my deconstruction had a further place that it needed to go.
So talk to me a little bit about, you're a pastor at a pretty decent sized church. What experiences kind of made you realize that you couldn't keep doing ministry the same way that your cohorts or counterparts were doing it? It's a lot of people don't think of church also as a business, right? It's a big, huge structure that has money coming in, it has payroll, it has all those kinds of things. It's probably tough to uh, make change in a situation like that. So talk to me a little bit about that
Yeah.
struggle where you're like, man, I really want to do X, Y, and Z, but it just doesn't fit with what they're doing here.
Yeah, so I was what's called a site pastor at a multi-site church. And so I led a congregation. I had my own congregation where I preached every Sunday, but it was a part of a broader family of churches and we all made decisions together. So like you said, I couldn't just turn the ship around and go off script. I was accountable to this sort of broader team. And, for the first few years that I was a pastor, I started pastoring in 2012. And until 2015, 2016, it was quite rosy for me. I think I had rose-colored glasses on a little bit. And I really did enjoy so much of what I was doing. I loved preaching. I loved the Bible. I loved people. I loved helping people. And I loved Jesus. I loved talking about Jesus and the way of Jesus. I think the first crisis where I began to feel like where I was being called was outside of the structure I was a part of was, like I said, around 2015, 2016, with the rise of Donald Trump to becoming the front runner of the Republican Party. It was sobering for me. I didn't really understand how that for many, 87%, I think, of evangelicals voted for Trump. And I saw that within my church that people were getting very, very passionate about him. Not just like, okay, nobody's perfect and I don't like this person and I don't like this person, but you got to pick one of them. Not so much like that, but like in the Trump parades, waving the flag, a level of buy-in that really shocked me because the 2015, remember when we first heard the Access Hollywood tape, for instance, and me just being really shocked because I grew up during the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky scandal. I remember when my dad sat me down, and that was when I first learned what a blowjob was. And he explained to me why character counts in the office, how, who the character of the president matters and that sort of thing. And seeing some of the same people that talked a lot about character when we were talking about a Democrat, all of a sudden ignoring what seemed very unignorable to me when we were talking about a Republican was very jarring. And there was some cognitive dissonance there. And I started to realize that for a lot of people, this is less about conviction, less about values, and it is more about cultural power. And that was a hard pill to swallow.
How was the response from, quote unquote, the church when you made some of these, like, oh, I might have a little bit of a difference of opinion with A, B, and Z, or, this theology or that theology? Was it well received from, like, literally the people that you worked with or your kind of circle of friends? Or was it like, Brian's a little crazy. We're
Yeah,
going to
a little bit of
kind of
both.
push
So
him off to the edge?
the other pastors were not huge Trumpers. If they were, that would have been really hard for me. They were more neutral, politically neutral. And when I would bring it up, because for me, it felt like a discipleship crisis that evangelicals were going this direction so hard and pulling our country that direction, which overall, it just seemed more and more like we were causing more harm in the country than good. We weren't bringing the kingdom of God, the values of Jesus, to welcome the stranger, to clothe the naked, to love the foreigner and the vulnerable and the least of these. Those values didn't seem like they were on display. It felt like cultural dominance was what we were pushing for. And I did talk to other pastors about this, and they were basically, somewhat sympathetic to some of what I was saying, maybe would push back on other things that I was feeling. But ultimately, they felt like we just needed to keep it about Jesus and not talk about those things. And to keep it about Jesus really meant to talk about a spiritual gospel, a gospel that is about believing the right things so that you are a Christian and you'll go to heaven when you die. And it had very little to do with things like the kind of worlds that we are creating, how we structure society, who benefits from the way that we structure society, and who gets left out of the way that we structure society. And I just felt like I was censoring myself in a lot of different ways. And I did that for a few years, trying to challenge the system in various ways while really feeling like I was pulling my punches and, kind of wrestling with that until 2020 was when I ultimately kind of reached a tipping point and had to put in my resignation.
Yeah, tell me about that, like, moment, because I think everybody's got those moments in their life where they're like very definitively chose a different direction than maybe what the norm is or what
Yeah.
people think they should do. Tell me about what that day was like for you to actually turn in that piece of paper or email or whatever it was. It had to
Yeah,
be
I had a meeting in
scary,
person. I was
freeing,
really
and all
scared,
those.
actually. So leading up to that, you know, 2020 was interesting because it was like this great pause where we got to reflect on what was happening because we were all of a sudden sequestered to our homes and we stopped meeting. Obviously, the church is a gathering. And so we stopped meeting publicly. We were on Zoom. And for a pastor, Sunday is always coming. And so it's very hard to be self-reflective as a pastor because you always have another sermon that you're preparing. There's always another event that you're planning. And so sometimes it's hard to do that big level thinking where you zoom out and actually ask, am I doing more harm than good here? Like, are we actually doing the right kinds of things? Because you have to keep that machine running. Like you mentioned, it is a business. You have to keep the tides coming in. You have to keep the programs moving. And so it can be hard to really reflect. Not only that, it's really hard to change your mind about something. Like, for example, a theological issue like deciding that you want to affirm queer people. That sounds all well and good. Oh, yeah, just decide that you want to affirm them. For a pastor, that would mean losing your job, which would also mean losing your network of relationships. When you're a pastor, they talk sometimes about how most of us have a family life, like a work life, and maybe hobbies. Pastors, often all three of those things are like the same thing. Like our family and our work and all of our free time it's almost all intertwined with the church and your network in the church. And so to just change your mind about a theological issue gets you removed from really your entire support network,
Oh.
your relational network, not to mention your salary. And so it's very costly to actually change your mind about any of this stuff. And so having that ability to reflect in 2020 when we stopped gathering, that was the first time where I think some things got to catch up inside me, things that were like bubbling up. And I got to really think about what does integrity look like for me, and what kind of cost am I willing to pay to enter that integrity. And ultimately what that meant for me was quitting. And that, that maybe won't be the same for everybody, but for me, in order to be authentic to who I felt I needed to be. And what I found to be really interesting. Oh, well, just to go back to your question though, I did have a meeting and I was really nervous, but I tried to leave really well. I didn't want to like destroy the whole church. I basically just said,
Burn
hey,
down the building on your way out.
No, man, I was really I tried to be really kind, but I basically said, I'm evolving in various ways, and I do feel like I'm having to pull my punches, and I'm not exactly sure. I didn't have a clear idea of, oh no, we should definitely be not doing it like this. We should be doing it like this. I just knew that I needed to be out of that institution to even begin to dream that way. Because sometimes those institutions, they can put a ceiling on even what's possible. And what I found was when I quit, it was like I changed so rapidly on a lot of other things too. And I didn't even realize the level at which I was censoring myself in order to hold on to belonging. And that is really the hardest thing about any deconstruction process, especially in the church. It's not just, yeah, the loss of certainly salary, but not even like changing your mind about beliefs, which can be scary. But actually, the loss of belonging is very unmooring, and you can feel a little bit alone through that process as well.
Yeah, this is kind of a little bit more of a personal question, but I am curious. Did it feel like you had to start over? Because I've talked to pastor friends before where they've quit for similar reasons, and it's like all their friends are just gone. All like they're just like sayonara because all their friends were inside that kind of structure of the church where they were paid staff people together. When you left that, was it like starting over? Did you have like any friends that stuck with you like through this new journey that you're going to be on and still on?
Yeah, so moved when I quit as well because I knew that I was in a very small town pastoring, and I knew that if I stayed there, it would have been hard to change in the public view of all the people that I had just been pastoring with, and I didn't want to run into all these people in the grocery store. So I moved to a new city. So by default, I lost a lot of my people. And then as I evolved, especially when I publicly came out in support of affirming queer people, that was a bit of the nail in the coffin. I mean, I've been in touch with some people. It's not like I'm disowned completely, but they did remove all my sermons from their website when I came out in support of queer people, and kind of, sent out like a church-wide email about me that like, hey, we're praying for Brian. He's teaching things that are, unbiblical and that sort of thing. And so, it does put some strain on those relationships for sure. And ultimately, though, I found that to be somewhat liberating. I think for some people, they do to placate some of those relationships that they know some of these systems that we can come out of, they're punishing system. They police difference by those mechanisms. I knew that if I became affirming, that the people that I used to pastor, that loved me, that supported me, that I experienced belonging from, I knew that they would view me as a heretic, as an unbeliever, as a backslider, somebody who they would now say, well, maybe he was never even a Christian to begin with. Like I knew that kind of thing was coming. And that's what keeps you from changing. That knowledge that they'll take that belonging from you. And so it is a scary thing. There have been some people that have, continued to stay connected to me, but it is definitely tough when you know that they have like an agenda for you as well. But no, I've had to make a lot of new friends, and that can be a difficult thing, but it can also be a really beautiful thing because I think the more authentic you become, you will lose people who
Yeah,
they'll say, well, you're not who you were, you're changing. I like the old version of you, but like I can't follow you where you're going. And that can be really hard. But the more authentic you are, you will draw people that love you for you. When you're being authentic, you'll find the relationships of the people that will actually stick with you for who you're becoming. And ultimately, the kind of people that I want with me are the ones who not only just love me for who I am right now, but love me whoever I'll become. Like they'll say, hey, like, oh, there's a new version of you. Well, I'd love to get to know him. That's the kind of energy I'm looking for.
that's awesome. So at some point you entertained the idea of writing a book. You wrote a book. It's called Hellbent. I'm going to put the link in the description. Talk to me a little bit about how that kind of came to be. There it is. Look at that. Folks listening in, if you DM me on my Instagram, which is Wildly Alaska, I'll put that in the description. If you DM me, I'm going to send a copy. I'm going to buy and send a copy of that book to the first 10 people that DM me. So DM me that you want the book, and I'll buy and send it to you off my Amazon account. But my question to you is this, Brian, what what first spurred on the idea of this book? We're going to get into the book more, obviously, but talk to me about how this idea came to be.
Yeah, so as I deconstructed, I did issue of hell was always one of the big ones for me that really bothered me. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I never liked believing in it, but it felt like you had to believe in it. It's a package deal. If you want Jesus, if you want heaven, you've got to take hell too. They all come together. not only that, but hell very much was like a Jenga piece, the load bearing one, where it's like it felt like if I took hell out of the Christian story, the whole tower would collapse. In other words, well, if there's no hell, then what's the point of being a Christian versus anything else? If there's no hell, then why did Jesus die? Didn't he die to save us from hell? Isn't Jesus a savior? What is salvation even if hell is not a thing? And so for me, deconstructing hell was really a part of me working through a lot of aspects of the Christian faith. And I knew that for a lot of people, hell ultimately was make or break in whether or not they stayed Christian. So a lot of people who deconvert completely and say, well, Christianity is not for me, it's because they can't get behind a punitive God who sends everyone who's not a Christian to hell. But what I really began to realize, especially as I encountered theologians outside of sort of white American Christianity, liberation theologians, Black theologians, Eastern theologians, womanist theologians, as I encountered different theologies and ways of approaching the Christian story, I realized that we were really impoverished because a spirituality that's primarily about believing the right things so that you go to heaven instead of hell when you die really robs us of the core aspect of what spirituality truly is, which is about growing in love in this life, especially for the sake of the most vulnerable people. And it puts all the weight on what you believe, believing the right dogmas for the sake of the afterlife. And I think that that actually robs us of the true message of Jesus, which is a message of love for the world. And so, yeah, as I began to work through this and I was getting a lot of questions, it just felt like, there was a book there because I knew that it was the book that I wish I had 10 years ago when I first started wrestling with some of these issues about deconstructing hell. And I wasn't seeing a lot out there. Now, there are a lot of resources out there that will point out, hey, some of the stuff you've learned about hell, it's not even in the Bible. It's apocalyptic language, hyperbolic language in the Bible that was never meant to be read literally. But the problem is it's not just about reframing. My book is not just about reframing a few Bible verses. It's about seeing the entirety of Christian spirituality, reframing it away from believing the right things for the sake of punishment avoidance, and instead embracing a vision for a life of loving transformation.
I think a lot of folks that are listening to this, I grew up in Iowa, middle America. And for folks that maybe didn't grow up going to church, is it a fair assumption to say a lot of kids in Sunday school are taught, believe in Jesus or you're going to go to hell, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I do this thing when I travel around, and I'm typically talking to groups of people that are mostly Christian or former Christian, where I'll say, hey, if you ever got saved, if you ever became a Christian, if you ever made a choice to accept Jesus Christ into your heart or accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, stand up. And usually the whole room will basically stand up. And then I'll ask, okay, if when you made that decision to get saved or make Jesus your savior, if when you made that decision, you knew about hell, in other words, you knew that hell was the consequence for not getting saved or not accepting Jesus into your heart, remain standing. And usually everybody will remain standing. Maybe one person will sit down. In other words, when we made that choice, it was almost no choice at all. It was a choice between, hey, do you want to believe this and not get punished forever? Or do you want to get saved and avoid punishment? And so it was a fundamentally coercive choice. And for a lot of us, that was at the very foundation of our spirituality. We made that choice when we were very young. That's the third question I'll ask. I'll say, hey, if you made that decision when you were younger than 10 years old, remain standing. And typically 90% of the people remain standing. That when we were very young, we were told that we were going to go to hell by default unless we got into a relationship with God. Now, I think the idea of a relationship with God is beautiful. I believe that you, I, all of us are in a relationship with God. But when we say that the condition of a relationship with God is this coercive threat, that robs us of the joy of a loving relationship. You can't build a loving relationship on the foundation of coercion and domination.
Do you think what's your take on, I would say, the, modern megachurch in America? Where do you think they land on this issue? And do you think it's a good place?
Yeah, so most mega churches are not talking about hell a lot, if at all, but they believe this. If you go to their statements of faith on their website, almost all of them will have this in their statement of faith, but they're not talking about it, which seems odd to me. So I confront that in my book as well, that to say that you believe this and not talking about it is even weirder, because if you really believe that everybody's not a Christian is going to go to hell, you should probably be talking about it. So instead, they kind of gaslight you and say, no, it's all about love. A normal megachurch will say it's all about love, But when you want to get in on it, when you want to become a Christian, that's when you find out that it's this black and white binary choice, heaven or hell. You're either one of us, you're an insider and therefore saved from God's punishment, or you're outside and you're going to be under threat of God's punishment. But they'll almost never say that on a Sunday morning. However, they know that if they change their minds about that, they would probably lose their giving. The tithing would dry up. People would say, oh, this is liberal. This is not Christian anymore. And they would turn their backs on it because, unfortunately, this is seen as a pretty fundamental pillar in Christianity. But I do not believe that it was fundamental to the way and the teaching of Jesus.
Yeah, what's your hope that this will spur people on to do? My guess is that they would maybe live less in fear and more in love. But talk to me a little bit about that, and then what does that look like practically? Because I think a lot of people will be like, well, great, sounds good, but what do I do then if I'm supposed to be living out of love as opposed to just worrying about my get out of hell free card?
Yeah, I think for me, because of hell, I was always one of the main issues with religion is making sure you were the right religion, you believed the right things, because the stakes were really, really high for believing the wrong things. But for me, letting go of a punitive God, and I recognize the point isn't being right. The point is growing in love. And so I no longer ask, is this the right thing to believe? Is this the correct doctrinal belief? Instead, I ask, what makes me bloom? What causes me to grow in love? And if a belief causes you to grow in love, I think that's worth believing. Now, I actually believe the way of Jesus is a beautiful path towards love, but not when we start with a punitive threat at the core of it. So yeah, I think my hope is that people will be able to embrace each other as well. I think this ruins our relationship with our neighbors. It causes Christians to be combative towards the world, to have this idea that, oh, the world, they're damned, they're going to hell, they're our project, we need to convert them, we need to colonize them. And that makes it impossible to really love our neighbor as ourself. I can't just accept you as you are if I think that who you are is going to hell. I have to convince you to agree with me. And so I think that letting go of some of these beliefs will allow us to be able to enter into relationships of mutuality, be more generous with our neighbors, not see people as threats to us that need to be excluded, but be able to embrace people right where they're at, and ultimately to embrace myself as well. Listen, if you believe, like I was taught, that by default, you are worthy of hell, like by default, you were born fundamentally worthy of the worst kind of punishment, and not just you, but everybody you know is worthy of that punishment, that affects how you view yourself and other people. And recognizing instead that God is with you. And I think the message of grace is that God's love doesn't have to be earned. You don't have to do anything to be loved, not anything at all. And that being able to embrace that love, embrace yourself, embrace other people right now in the present moment, I think is where true spirituality starts.
Did you ever have doubts when you're kind of in your reconstruction of this? Because I think some folks, when they make a radical shift like this, they also shift away from Jesus or the Bible altogether. Was there a time where you were on the cusp of maybe just like, becoming agnostic or atheist or something like that? That, I think could, folks could, I think folks have done that in the past, right? Where they've kind
Definitely.
of stepped away from the church and
Yeah.
then just kind of done a 180.
As my beliefs were evolving, there was a moment where I was like afraid that I was like, oh no, am I on the slippery slope? Am I going to become an atheist? And I was afraid of that. But then I realized that I know a lot of atheists, and many of them are incredible people who have better values than a lot of the Christians I know. And I don't think that they're going to hell. I think that they're amazing people that are doing good things in the world. And what I realized was that if I become an atheist, because that's honestly where I'm at, and it's like, hey, I'm just being honest about where I've landed and where I believe, then that would be okay. And it wouldn't be a bad thing. So I had to take the moral judgment off the table because honestly, so many of us, there's this concept of beginner's mind. Very few of us approach our religious beliefs with beginner's mind. In other words, with intellectual honesty. We come with the baggage of how we've been shaped because the stakes are so high. Hell makes it really hard to just say, hey, let me just evaluate these things honestly, because it's like, well, but what if I'm wrong? What if I go to hell? But taking away hell out of the equation and recognizing if I become an atheist because that's honestly where I'm at, I don't want to say that that would be a morally inferior thing. And so now the reason I'm not an atheist isn't because I think it's really important to be a Christian or else. And like, if I was an atheist, that would be bad because atheists are going to burn. No, no, no. The reason I'm not an atheist is so simple. It's because I still believe in God. Like just genuinely, like it makes more sense of my experience of the universe and life. And I've had experiences that make me believe that there is a more, that there is a transcendent and also an immanent God. And I've just experienced God. And so I decide the fear went away when I realized, hey, if I become an atheist, because that's honestly where I'm at, then that would be okay. But you know what? I'm not an atheist, and that's fine too. Now, I will say that the way that I hold my Christianity is certainly different than it used to be. I don't care that much about labels. Like some people would say, "Oh, you're not a Christian because you don't believe in this sort of reward and punishment system of heaven and hell." But the way of Christianity before it was sort of this dogmatic list of beliefs, it was a path of following Jesus. What it means to be a Christian is to be a follower of Jesus, and I still see Jesus as a spiritual teacher worth imitating, and I encounter God in the person of Jesus. And that doesn't mean that nobody else can encounter God any other way, but that's where I experience the divine. So I still hold on to my Christianity.
That's awesome. So you also have, for folks listening in, I'm going to put your social media links into the podcast description. You also are not shy or fearful of talking about hot button issues. I think I watched one of your Instagram reels recently where you talked about the anti-Semitic hate and the anti-Muslim hate that's kind of rampant around the US, and that we should, your 2 cents on it was that we should be weary of both, right? That it's not one or the other, that we probably shouldn't hate either one of those folks. So talk to me a little bit about that, because you hit not just maybe specifically that issue, but you are not afraid to go after hot button kind of headline issues that I think almost every other
Yeah. Well,
person in your shoes that's like,
yeah, I see this as the spirit. So for me, the realm of why does spirituality matter? I think it matters for the here and now, for the kind of world that we're building. Unfortunately, religion so frequently is used as a tool by systems of domination to other people, to scapegoat people, to exclude people, to create rigid binaries, who's in and who's out, why it's okay to not have empathy for that kind of person because they're the wrong kind of person, and to draw these lines between people. And unfortunately, Christianity has been used that way. We're seeing it used that way right now in our country. But I don't think that's what Jesus was all about. Jesus was about erasing those boundary lines, about welcoming people in, about recognizing who society was built to exclude and including those people. He recognized the people that were being labeled as outsiders, and he built big long tables that included the people that you weren't supposed to eat with. And that's why the main complaint about Jesus from his religious peers,
he was a drunk.
well, yeah, he's a drunk. He's a sinner. He eats with sinners. He welcomes sinners, and he partied with them. Okay, like these were his kind of people. It wasn't like he just gathered the sinners together in order to preach at them so that they could get saved and not go to hell. No, he was like, oh, you people who are being told that you don't belong. He said, you belong. You've always belonged. God has always been with you. And I think we've lost sight of that. There are political ramifications to the gospel. And I think that often Jesus is weaponized as a mascot to sort of baptize a very rigid hierarchical society where that is often, it's often fueled by male dominance, unfortunately. Men were the ones speaking for God in the system that I grew up in. And oftentimes it's still very common within most forms of Christianity that you have very rigid gender hierarchies. And I'm always just asking when I see these different forms of religion, who's benefiting from that status quo and who is being excluded, who is being oppressed and left out of power in these situations? Because Jesus was always noticing who is being left out of power, and he made them his priority. His message of the kingdom of God was that the last will be first. Blessed are the poor. That's what Jesus did. And so that's what I'm trying to do as well, imperfectly, but that's my
Nice. So what's your advice to folks to that maybe feel some of these, like there's going to be a lot of people listening to this be like, man, I kind of felt like a little bit like this or a little bit like that. But I think a lot of people don't know you only get two choices, right? You either go to church and you're a part of this machine or you don't go. What's your advice to folks that are maybe curious about some of the things that you're talking about? Obviously, go check out the book, go buy the book. But outside of that, where do they start? Because I think it can be daunting to folks. Not everybody has the confidence that you've been blessed with to be able to stick out, do these kinds of things. And a lot of people feel stuck or don't know where to start or why even try, right? Because it's,
Yeah.
not going to make a difference.
Yeah, well, it depends. If I'm talking to somebody who's a Christian, but feels like they're a part of a movement of Christianity that's not accurately representing Jesus, I don't think that the only way to do this is to go to church. But I am a part of a church that I believe does actually live out some of the things that I've been speaking about. And there are many amazing progressive Christian churches that make it a lot more about us living out the ethic of love than about making sure that our dogma is correct so that we go to heaven instead of hell when we die. The Episcopal Church, the United Methodist Church, there's a growing number of non-denominational churches in that category. Unfortunately, the predominant group of Christian churches in America are still more evangelical and more dogmatic in their approach, and they can kind of give the whole movement a bad rap. But I don't think it has to happen in the church. I think the church has a beautiful opportunity in a moment when people are really lonely, really alienated, really divided. And often we have a society that's very individualistic and is splitting us all apart. I think the church is a great place where you can experience mutual aid and community and lift each other up. But just as often, churches don't do that, but find that wherever you can find it. And, I think we need each other right now more than ever with what our country is going through right now. There's a rise of fascism, and that fascism, if we're honest, is often being fueled by Christianity. Christian theology often lies behind it. If you look into Project 2025 and the origins of some of what's going on right now, a lot of this is theological. But Christianity was never supposed to be about gaining cultural power to sort of enforce our hierarchies on everybody else. I do believe it should be about loving our neighbors. So find some neighbors to love. And I love Mr. Rogers' advice. I always cling to when I'm really overwhelmed and I'm not sure what else. He said, look for the helpers. That was his thing. When bad shit is going down around you, look for who's helping, who is leading, who is contributing to life instead of death, who is contributing to flourishing instead of harm. It's usually really obvious. Find those helpers and join them.
So where can folks find your book, find you on social media, for folks that are listening in their car and that can't write anything down because they'll get in a wreck? Tell us the best place they can find you.
Anywhere books are found. It's really cheap on Amazon right now because they're trying to put all local bookstores out of business. So, if you don't have any ethical problems with that, that's the cheapest place to get it. But I always recommend if you can get it at a local bookstore, it should be there. It's called Hell Bent, How the Fear of Hell Holds Christians Back from a Spirituality of Love. And you can find me on Instagram at BE.Recker. I also write pretty regularly on Substack. You can find me on there, Brian Recker.
And they could probably subscribe to your Substack pretty easily, right? If they go
Yeah,
there.
It's a free or a paid subscription. Most of my posts are free, though, just to get them out there for people.
Nice. Well, I'll put the Substack link in the podcast description. Brian, I really appreciate you joining us. We went an extra 10 minutes. Do you have any last-minute thoughts here before we head off?
Good luck out there, folks. If 2026 is anything like 2025, we're going to need each other. So, find your people and hold on tight.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Brian. You're welcome back anytime. It's fascinating to follow folks like you, people like Rob Bell, Joshua Harris, folks that have maybe shifted their theology a little bit, but still have a lot to say in the world. So I appreciate your thoughts. I appreciate you having a voice in the crowd, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thanks, man. Great to be here.